Hello, for this presentation, we're going to review Module 24 from Exploring Psychology in Modules 10th edition by Myers and Dewall. This section is about forgetting, memory construction, and improving memory. So there are some people that want a super memory, and there are people that have it. There's a couple things that the author brings to point at the beginning of this section. He says that the people that do have this super memory, where they're able to recall specific details from days past, they describe it as nonstop, uncontrollable, and exhausting. And so actually, if you really think about it, we don't want to be able to remember everything that happens every second of the day. We want our brain to be able to process the things to keep and the things to throw away. And I like this quote that they used in the text: amnesia seeps into the crevices of our brains and amnesia heals. Just something to think about. All right, so let's talk about forgetting. First, there's two types of amnesia. The first one is called anterograde. Sorry, let me say that again. Anterograde amnesia. This is the ability to recall the past, but you cannot make new memories now. The text has two different cases that it mentions. One was from someone that had surgery on their brain, and then the other one was someone who suffered brain damage. And in both of these cases, they suffered this type of amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is a little different. It's when you're unable to recall the past, meaning things in your long-term memory. So the anterograde amnesia is where the person constantly feels they're still living in the past. They may still think of themselves as a 21-year-old person at the time that they had their brain damage, even though they're 70 years old, because they cannot make these new memories. Where retrograde, they don't recall their past at all. So they have some interesting cases, and this I think the author was really clever to bring about, was different studies where even people with amnesia are able to learn new tasks and skills. They just don't recall that they learned it. So what this means is they can be taught new skills, and then, a couple of days later, they'll be asked, "Can you make this origami penguin?" They say, "Well, no, I can't." And they say, "Well, try." And so then all of a sudden they make the origami penguin, and they are amazed that they did this because they do not recall that they learned the skill. So the interesting thing about this is that means that we have two distinct memory systems. There's the memory system that allows you to recall something that is learned, and then there's the memory system of being able to recall these past details. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about encoding failure. Start with this quote: "Much of what we sense, we never notice, and what we fail to encode, we will never remember." So that's the short way of saying this long sequence. So we have these external events that happen. We pick up on them with our sensories and put in sensory memory, sorry. It is something that's brought to attention in our brain. It's brought to the short-term memory. And then here's the part where our brain either encodes it or it fails to encode it. And in that case, then that is forgotten material. If it is encoded, then it moves into our long-term memory storage. So older people actually have a less responsive brain function where encoding incurs, meaning that it may seem like they're forgetful or they don't remember things, but actually it's just this one step in this sequence where the encoding did not occur. Without encoding, the memories don't form. So I thought this was an interesting example in the text as well. There was a research study, and they asked people to draw the logo for Apple. So I'd actually like you to take a second right now. If you've seen this logo before, which I think most of us have, get out a pen, pencil, paper, pause this presentation, and try to see if you can draw the logo for Apple. All right, once you're finished with that, let's see what the study found. The study only had 1 out of 85 college students that were able to do this, and 52 of those were Apple users. All right, so let's talk about the storage. There is a decay in storage, so even if you encode something, you may actually forget it later. This happens one of 3 reasons. Either one, it never really was encoded in the first place. We thought we moved it into our long-term memory, but in actuality, it wasn't. The second one is that the brain discarded it. And then the third one is, well, we just simply can't retrieve it. Meaning some people think of it like a file cabinet. It's just locked away somewhere and you just can't seem to retrieve it. Kind of like when you meet someone and you know their name. Their name started with a K, but you just can't think of their name. That's kind of step number 3. So there was one psychologist who did a study on this, and he proposed something called the forgetting curve. So if you look on the left, this is the percentage of information that was retained. So if you notice at the very beginning, it was around 60-something% of the information was able to be retained, and then that lasted for a little while, and then it dropped significantly and then leveled out, but it stayed leveled out over a time of days. So this just means that there's a rapid decrease in our ability to recall information, and then it just levels out over time. So it's in that storage somewhere. All right, moving on, retrieval failure, the failure to be able to retrieve information. There's a couple of good points that I wanted to bring out from the text. It says, often forgetting is not memories faded, but memories unretrieved. Meaning that those memories are still there, written in the brain somewhere. We're just unable to actually retrieve them. Remember that file cabinet I talked about? We're unable to get into that file, quote unquote. We store in long-term memory what's important to us or what we've rehearsed. Now, we're going to get to that in a minute. But think back in your own long-term memory, what key events do you remember? And I'm going to guess that some of those were probably important events. It may have been your first date. It may have been first time that you visited a particular city. Whatever it is, they were important to you in some way. And then we also forget because of something called interference. Which kind of sounds like an athletic term. And motivated forgetting. So let's first talk about interference. So this is when new and old learning basically collide with one another. And there's 2 different types. So we have proactive interference. This is when things that you've learned prior disrupts your recall for new information. One example is when you get a new phone number. You try to remember the new phone number, you repeat it to yourself, and yet the memory of your old phone number keeps getting in the way of you memorizing the new number. Retroactive interference is when the new learning disrupts the recall of the old learning that already occurred. So this would be, let's say you were in school and your teacher taught you a neat little rhyme to remember, I don't know, adverbs. And it was to a tune to an old song, but you can't remember the lyrics to the old song because of the new song that has now taken the place over that same tune. And then there's motivated forgetting. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but you process it, you encode it, and then you forget about it, but you forget about it in a way that favors either what you want or what you want to perceive. So actually, I forgot we're going to go over a couple tips first. So tip number 1, I brought these out specifically for learning for you all. So information the hour before sleep has the least amount of interference. So because of that, one study found that memory of new information occurred better if someone studied before sleep versus earlier in the day. Now, we'll go to the second point on when that happens. So remember, this was about an hour before sleep versus people that studied at the same level, the same information earlier in the day. The hour before sleep is that good time with the least amount of ear interference, but it cannot be the seconds just before sleep. That time period, you actually seldom remember. So it actually has to be a fair amount of time before you go to bed, but close enough to the time that you go to sleep so that there's minimal interference. Now, some people have said, and I know this was the case when I was in school, oh, just play the recording while you're asleep and your brain will hear it. Well, technically, your ears will hear it. They will pick up the sound, but it's not going to be committed to memory. Sorry, studying's not that easy. All right, let's talk about positive transfer. This is when information you've learned previously helps you learn new information. So Latin may help you with learning French or even some English words. This is called positive transfer. Now, this next theory is actually has some controversy around it. So it's a theory that Freud came up with, and it's called repression. And you probably heard about this before, repressed memories. What he theorized is it was a defense mechanism that basically gets rid of these anxiety-provoking thoughts, feelings, memories out of our consciousness. So if someone suffered something that was very traumatic as a young child or even as an adult, that their brain could actually repress the memory, and then they to help with the anxiety or any of the negative effects from that traumatic event. However, some modern day psychologists actually say that's the opposite is probably more true, which is that it's actually intrusive memories. So traumatic events don't result in repressed memories. They actually result in intrusive memories, and it's very difficult to forget things that have a strong emotion tied to them. So that emotion tied to the event is actually going to create that unwanted memory to stay there. All right, so now let's talk about something that I find fascinating, and that's errors in our memory construction or reconstruction. So the first one let's talk about reconsolidation. This is when previous stored memories are retrieved, but then they're altered, and then we store them again. So let's kind of talk about this. As the quote says right there, we don't just retrieve memories, we reweave them. So the more you replay a memory, you're actually likely taking the original memory and then you're altering it in some modified way, and then that alteration now gets stored as the new file, if you will. So you have the original file, you make some edits, and then you save it as a new file, and that's now the memory that is saved. It's replaced. So what this means is that to some degree, not maybe a lot, a little, it just all depends, all memory is going to be altered in some way. So the less you recall that event, the more closer that memory will be to the original. All right, let's move on. Misinformation effect. This is when misleading information actually corrupts someone's memory of an event. I find this very fascinating, possibly because I wanted to go into criminal justice when I was younger, and so this kind of thing intrigues me. Let's talk about one experiment that uses misinformation effect. So researchers told people to recall 2 events from their past, but what they did is they said, we want you to make one of these events up. One of them false. And that false event, we want you to create you committing a crime of some sort. So pretend that you're recalling 2 memories. One of them's real and the other one's made up, and in that made up one, you're committing a crime. Then after some time, they interviewed the people and they found that 70% of the people reported details of the false memories, and they said they committed a crime. Like it had become part of their memory. Now, it gets even better, if you will. They can even report richer details of false memories that never existed. The author talks about how he remembered his parents bringing his new sibling home from the hospital on this transit system. But when he talked to his parents later on, they said, we never rode the transit system coming home from the hospital. So he had actually created this detail in a memory that never existed. All right, let's talk about source amnesia. This is attributing to the wrong source an event of experiences that we heard about, read about, or imagined. I want you to think about that. It could be something you heard, read, or imagined. This is also called source misattribution. With this misinformation effect, the source, or really the heart, at many false memories. And let me think of, I'm trying to think of an example here. All right, so for example, let's say your friend told you about his trip to Wisconsin, and then a year later you can recall all the details about the trip. However, you're not sure about how you learned about the details. Then you falsely conclude that you yourself traveled to Wisconsin. You may even reason that you recall the things so clearly because you must have been there yourself. That would be an example of source amnesia. Let's also talk a little bit about déjà vu. I know that is kind of a common term that we throw around. It's that sense that you've experienced something before. What this actually is it's a sense of familiarity, but your brain cannot recall the past event that was so familiar. And so it does this kind of emotional tug to go, well, this must have some other meaning to it because it's so familiar, but yet it's just that you can't recall what is familiar about it, that wasn't able to be recalled in your memory. I like this. It says, like fake diamonds, false memories seem real. So we even will add details to the stories that we don't remember, and the more, this is really important, the more that a story is retold, the more it becomes solidified as a real memory. So if you think about someone who says, oh, I made the winning touchdown in my senior year football game, and then they tell this story over and over again, over and over again, over again, and then by the time they're 70 years old, that story is going to be significantly altered from the actual real event. Piaget actually also chimes in here, and he himself recalled an event that as an adult he found out never even occurred, but rather it was just a story that was told to him, and he thought it was an actual event that had happened to him. All right, so how do you discern between true and false memories? Because memory is reconstruction as well as reproduction. So that if you take anything away from this, I want you to take that away. That memory is reconstruction and reproduction. We can't be sure whether a memory is real or really how real it is just because of how it feels. So what does this mean in real life? 75%, I want you to hear this again, 75%, 3/4 of 301 convicts that were exonerated later by DNA testing had been misjudged based on faulty eyewitness identification. It is all too common for caterpillars to become butterflies and then to maintain that in their youth they had been little butterflies. Maturation makes liars of us all. So it just means as the time passes that we actually cannot recall the information. We can't be really considered to be 100% that actually really did occur because of memory reconstruction. All right, so let's talk about children and their eyewitness and their ability to recall. Like adults, they can be influenced by everything that we've already covered. So people that work with children, especially people that work in like child protective services and things of that nature, they have to try to get the most accurate memory recall. Now, there's ways to do this. One of them is to question about what happened only with neutral words. What this is like you're not leading them in a direction. So if you say, "What noise did you hear when you were at your house?" Well, then you're telling them that they heard a noise. So interview questions have to be very neutral. Also, the interview needs to occur very quickly with someone who's trained in this type of interview technique, um, and not have talked over already with other adults involved in this situation. So the best case would be to talk with a child who is a neutral person, who's able to do the questions in neutral words, and have that be kind of the first interview with anybody, so that we don't have some of those biases that we talked about earlier, where someone tells them what happened and then they put that in their memory as something that actually did happen. All right, so like children whose frontal lobes have not fully matured, older adults, especially those whose frontal lobe functioning has declined, are more susceptible than young adults to false memories. Unfortunately, this makes older adults vulnerable to scams, such as if a repair person was over at their house and they said, "Well, I told you it was going to cost $75 and you agreed to that, remember?" And then they go, oh yeah, I guess that's what we agreed to pay, when in reality they maybe agreed to $40. So that's so our last slide here, we are going to talk about improving memory, which really is just a list of ways that you can help study. So I hope you find this slide most useful in your studies. The first way that you can improve information recall is to rehearse it repeatedly and to space out the time in which you practice. This could be something like separate study sessions. Whatever it is, just know that you need to repeat the information, rehearse the information, because minimal rehearsal means little retention. The next thing, and the reason why I asked for notes, is when you take lecture notes in longhand, that's pen and paper, writing on a piece of paper. This requires summarizing the material in your own words, and it leads to better retention than it does if you're just copying down things like definitions, or if you're just copying down verbatim what the professor's saying, word for word, and you're not putting it in your own words. It's not going to retain as well. So when you take notes, try to do it with pen and paper, and try to not take verbatim notes. Don't take notes just on the definitions, but take it over the way in which you understand that definition or the way you understand that material. Third way to help you in your studies is to make the material meaningful. One way that I personally do this is I relate it to something in my own life. So, for example, if I met someone who I'd never been around before and he said his name was Mike, then I could go, okay, Mike. Oh, that's the same name as my brother. Okay, my brother's name is Mike, his name is Mike. Now I've related those two pieces of information to something that is important and meaningful in my own life, and I'm more likely to recall his name next time I see him. The fourth one is to do retrieval cues. This is when, let's say, you're in a lecture and the professor goes over something and then you see it on the test and you haven't studied it. Then you can mentally go back to the time and even the way in which you felt when you heard the information. So you can close your eyes, you can picture it in your mind, you sitting in that desk, hearing the lecture, and then you may actually recall what was said. This can also be done, interestingly enough, if you studied something at home or in your dorm, and then you're sitting there in front of your test or your quiz, and you can put yourself back in that situation of when you were going over your note cards or going over your notes, and then you can picture it in your mind and recreate that and be able to retrieve the information. You can also use fun things like stories, acronyms, rhymes. This is very old, but that song, which says, "Is it bananas? Bananas." Well, I can guarantee you that every little kid that heard that song from that point forward could now spell bananas, because it was in that kind of that song, that rhyme, that's something that for whatever reason, our brains are able to recall fairly well. Also, like we talked about earlier, minimize that interference. This means study about an hour before bed and don't study topics that are too similar to with each other. So French and Spanish are very similar to one another, and then the information will kind of cross over. You don't want to study, your biology and earth science, back to back or whatever it is, but maybe study math and then study your language arts. But try to study topics back to back that are not like one another. Also, sleep. When you sleep, your brain is able to reorganize and consolidate that information into your long-term memory. If it's the middle of the day and you've been studying for a couple hours, it actually also helps just to take about a 10-minute break or so and just kind of lie down or rest a little bit. And even that rest period will help you with memorization. And lastly, test your knowledge. This is how you can do like the note card method, where you have the question on one side or the definition on one side and the term on the other side. And it's just any way where you're testing yourself, doing those online Quizlets, any method that you can do to kind of test your knowledge will also help it go into the memory. So that wraps up our module for this week, and please let me know if you have any questions.